All right, kia ora and welcome to the latest edition of the Language Fuel podcast. I think we're up to season 2, episode 8. Between the last episode and this one, I've been to the CLESOL conference. Now, CLESOL in New Zealand, it stands for Community Languages and ESOL, which is really lovely. So as well as teaching English, which is of course a local language, it's also focused on how to encourage the community languages, heritage languages, and so on, which naturally is Maori, a lot of Pacific Island languages, but there were definitely representatives there talking about, say, European languages from migrants and so on. So I like the balance, the fact that it's not just an ESOL teaching conference or an English teaching conference. It's really going, hey, we are a multilingual society, some cities more than others, Auckland in particular, extremely multilingual. Let's recognize that, and how do we celebrate it? I thought I'd use this episode to talk about some shifts that I have noticed since the last time I attended a CLESOL conference, and admittedly, I think that would have been at least 6 years ago, possibly even 8. It's only every second year, so it's going to be an even number. It could have been 8, it may have been, no, it was definitely 8, yep, because of things in my career where I wasn't in the industry for a wee while. And so this is just a little collection of thoughts of the latest, trends that are happening, people talking, some of the research going on, and I thought it might be helpful for some of my listeners here. So first of all, I want to just touch on some of the teacher training threads that I noticed, and I made a point of attending the teacher training sessions simply because obviously that's what we're doing here at Language Fuel with our online training. So I noticed really a theme of breaking the mold and having unique methods of teaching. So one of the sessions I went to, I've just got notes over here, is Martin Andrews' session. Now, Martin's actually an old colleague of mine, so kia ora, Martin, if you're watching this or listening to this. He was doing some initial teacher training in Melbourne, actually, and he focused, and they were just sort of reporting on how that went, and in particular, they talked about the trainees keeping a reflective journal. But what I really loved about his talk was he used the metaphor of teachers putting on a habitus, like those sort of gowns, I guess, a habit, or having a habitat, that's where all those words come from. So putting on an identity as a language teacher when they go on to practicum and basically giving it a go and seeing how it feels to them to put on that identity and what that's like. Which of course is unique because that emphasizes the fact that every teacher trainee is going to have their own unique identity in how it is for them as a teacher and what sits well with them. It's obviously going to mix in with their personality type, their own strengths and weaknesses and so on. I loved the fact that he emphasized aha moments. So in the reflective journal, he got them to notice many things, but included, what are the aha moments you're having on practicum? And that's super, super powerful. So apart from the idea, the strong metaphor there of, donning a habitus, putting on an identity, a new identity as a teacher, I just loved the idea of keeping a reflective journal. Now, we all should be doing this, whether we're teaching or whether we're learning. We should be having language learning journals, or whether we're just doing any other job. It's very popular these days too. You can just sort of Google it and see a whole bunch of people talking about the idea of reflection and journaling as a really powerful tool for self-development. So love the fact that he was really pushing for this style of assessment of that initial teacher training. All right, one of the other sessions that I went to was a informal chat between some trainers, again pre-service trainers, and what they noticed, they were saying, hey, in the last several years, I want to say probably a decade, I guess, there's been a shift in that a lot of the teacher trainees now are non-native speakers. I'm guessing that this is a worldwide phenomenon, certainly not just New Zealand. I'm sure there'll be many other countries, even sort of quote-unquote native-speaking English countries, where this shift has been happening. So they were reflecting on that in a conversational way and saying some of the, I guess, cookie cutter training packages that these guys deliver. You can fill in the gaps there in terms of international recognized certificates and that sort of thing. they were saying, these things haven't changed in decades, but our clientele has really changed. And so the conversation was, what do we do about this, and how do we supplement, I guess, these standard packages, rather than having people come in one end, give them a package, send them out the other end with a stamp on their forehead saying you are now trained. Let's be a little bit more realistic. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was, their needs are very different. For example, a native speaker who wants to become an English teacher often, obviously stereotyped here, but often isn't necessarily really conscious of the language awareness features. So they need to learn consciously the rules of English grammar and so on, so they can explain them as necessary. Whereas a non-native speaker, typically, again, stereotypically, has had to learn all of these things as they've learned English. So they are very conscious of the grammar rules, and their needs will be in other areas. So perhaps these stock standard courses need to have less of a focus on language awareness and that sort of thing, and more of a focus on perhaps more higher level English skills, for example. Whatever it is, obviously every cohort's going to be different as well. You have a class of 20 coming in, that's 20 unique individuals. So while that was an informal conversation, mainly among those who were in bigger institutions, I found that very encouraging, because what we're doing at Language Fuel is saying, hey, we're going to put up a whole library of courses, some on language awareness, some on all sorts of things. Teachers can come in when you have a subscription and pick and choose what it is you need to know. We're not saying you have to do A, B, C, and then you're done. It's like there's a whole lot of stuff out there. Pick what's your highest need and help yourself. So it's self-paced, self-access kind of training. So I was really glad to see that, we're on the mark there with what we're doing here at Language Fuel, and that the wider industry is starting to wake up to some of these ideas that, we can't just kind of cookie cutter our training. And one of the other things in terms of language teacher training I thought was really fascinating. So this was a session from Tanby Tin. She's at the University of Auckland, and she was super eloquent in her explanation that, there's actually many different ways to learn a language. Often for those of us who've been in the industry and we are familiar with the, I guess, more popularized methods of training and teaching, we forget that there's actually a whole lot of other ways as too. So she did some research in Myanmar, and that's actually where she comes from originally. And her research was super clear. She said, look, some of these methodologies that we train, and she's a language teacher trainer too, she said sometimes they just don't work in other contexts. So the study that she told us about was a classroom in Myanmar. And she said, look, they've got 40 students in a class, jam squashed into a small room. They have very long days. I'm not quite sure how they structure it, but the point was this class that she was observing was a Friday afternoon, 5 p.m. till 8 p.m. Wow, good on the teacher for teaching at that time of day. Probably had no choice. They're squashed in there. She said there's no resources. They just don't have the funding to have books and, videos and readers, just all of that sort of stuff that in countries like New Zealand we may take for granted. She said, they've got very little resources, very little space. It's hot, stinking hot with the, tropical afternoon sun streaming through the window. She said, the students don't want to move. If they move, they break out into a sweat. It's just not going to happen. So when we talk, in our westernized sort of training, we say, get them into groups, get them moving around the room, talking this, talking that. She said it's just so foreign and it doesn't work in that environment. So she was then examining, well, how does the teacher enable students to learn in that kind of environment, which is, so unique? And she said he talked a lot, this particular teacher that she was studying. He just talked and talked and talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. The students did also answer questions in a choral fashion when he asked them. And they had, I think, one handout that she was telling us about this lesson. But and the students learned, and she said, actually, she is from Myanmar herself. She said, I learned that way too. I was talked at and talked at. She said, my listening skills are superb. And so, that might be the only English that she was exposed to, which is the language of the teacher there. So she was saying we shouldn't necessarily assume a lot when we're training teachers about, teacher talk is bad, students moving around the room is good. She said, it really depends on the context. Now, I won't go into all the details of how she sort of unpacked that lesson, what he did, but it was really cool, and it was so refreshing just to say, you know what, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, and we shouldn't assume certain ways are the best ways. So I really, really appreciated that. So kia ora Tanby, if you're listening to this. Now, another super interesting talk was from Angel Lin. Now, she was one of the keynote speakers from the University of Hong Kong, and she talked about translanguaging. Now, that is a very big word, but to cut to the point of what she was saying is we shouldn't restrict students' first languages in the classroom. Now, this was, again, a major shift from what it was 10, 20 years ago, and I think I've told the story on this podcast before of when I was a very new teacher, 20 years ago really, and we did practices like we had a first language jar where you put 10 cents in if you accidentally spoke your first language, because it was absolutely not acceptable in the English classroom to speak your first language. And that even got me into trouble socially. You know, we had some issues around that. Now, going to this conference and hearing her saying, hey, people need their first language as a meaning-making system to help them make sense of the new language that they're bringing on board. And she had wonderful examples that she was unpicking of how it was super helpful for students to explain to one another and that sort of thing. So really great to acknowledge the fact that, you know, students need to use whatever resources they can in their learning process. Now, it's very different from students having a chat in the corner about what they did in the weekend. That's not what she's talking about. And she was very clear. She said, look, you know, as a teacher, you know if they're on task and thinking about what you're saying and chatting to one another to make the meaning versus, you know, mucking around. So that's, I guess, the caveat to put there. But in any case, it was wonderful to hear her say, let's celebrate the resources that students bring, even if it's a different language that helps them build the bridge to the new language that they're learning. That was a really great session. All right, so I guess the point is that I loved the acknowledgement from many different places that there's no one right way to teach a language, and the flip side, of course, there's no one right way to learn a language. There's 1,000 different ways, and we should encourage all of it and whatever's going to work for a particular person or a particular situation. All right, the other strong thread that I came out with was this celebration of community languages and Māori in particular. So some of the outstanding speakers, we had Paulette Tamati-Elliffe. Now, she had an inspiring story to tell. It's her personal story about bringing up her children in te reo Māori, even though she and her husband did not speak te reo fluently or proficiently. So they learned alongside their children and pushed through to make sure that, you know, the language of the home was in fact Māori, so they could give that gift to the next generation. Very cool story, and she's doing amazing things to encourage other Māori families to do the same. We also had Jeanette King from the University of Canterbury talking about the revitalisation of the Māori language, and that was super inspiring, some fantastic things going on and great signs that te reo is definitely being more widely spoken now than in the past several decades, in fact. And the last person, I guess, to mention was Ray Si'ilata from the University of Auckland, and she was another inspiring talk about how important it is for children, and we're talking about very young children, so primary school children, attending school in a New Zealand environment where English is the language of instruction, how important it was that they had access to bilingual materials that incorporate their mother tongue. So imagine a Samoan child being able to access a reading book that had English and Samoan side by side. And it just so nicely tied in with Angel Lin's research on how we learn. The fact that if we can tie into what we already know, then we can build and add on to it. So the literacy outcomes for students who can access bilingual materials is far greater than for those children who are told, you know, no, we're only speaking English and we're only focusing on English in the classroom. So, you know, that the takeaway there was we really should be encouraging bilingualism, and in fact multilingualism where it's appropriate among our students, and not monolingual English classes. It's just a myth to think that a monolingual classroom is good for students who are actually not monolingual. Now, the reality is that a place like Auckland has quite a bit of work to do to enable these philosophies to become a reality. And any Auckland primary school teacher will tell you they've got many students who don't speak English in the home. They may be called ELLs or ESOL students, and frequently they're sort of considered problematic because they don't fit the mold. How is a teacher meant to teach 30 students when half of them have a different mother tongue? I don't know the answer. I'm not saying there's any magic bullet. I myself have not taught in a primary classroom, but all I'm doing is pointing you to academics who've done the research that says bilingual literacy materials really make a difference there. So don't fight it, teachers. Let's celebrate that bilingualism. Bring families into the classroom and so on. Now, for my part, seeing as we run the Language Fuel Resource Room here in New Zealand, and we're New Zealand's only languages specialty store, I have made a decision to consciously look for suppliers of bilingual books for younger learners. We certainly have some in our catalogue, but there's definitely room to incorporate a whole lot more. So that's something that we will be doing in the coming months, because I was so excited to hear about the opportunity there. And I guess the last thing that I took away from the CLESOL conference was that it was a fantastic opportunity to meet up with friends, both old and new. Many of my former teacher colleagues were there, as well as some of our Language Fuel customers, whether Language Fuel Resource Room customers or the Language Fuel training customers. So that was really great. Now, just before I go, speaking of Language Fuel training, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you will know that we have been working on moving all of our courses to a new platform. So up until now, we've had a site called the Language Fuel Academy. And I'm very happy to say that our transfer process is now complete. So we have got Language Fuel training up and running. The old site, Language Fuel Academy, will actually be taken offline in the next couple of weeks, and all of our existing customers will be moved over to that new site. So I'm super happy with the new platform. Not only does it have webinar and discussion capabilities right there in the site itself, but we've also redesigned all of our courses so that we've got the latest software, and they're much more accessible. They're mini courses now rather than big longer ones that we had. So there's a whole bunch of mini ones rather than a smaller number of large ones, and you can complete them in one sitting. If you haven't had a chance yet to check out that new platform, please do head on over to our website, languagefuel.com, click on the training button, and you'll see there some links and information about how that works. And the other thing you'll see is we have two separate sites now, whereas we used to have the one Language Fuel Academy, which had some language learning courses, how to go about learning a language, and some teaching. We've really focused now, so we've got two. One is for English language teachers. So if you're teaching ESOL or EFL or EAL at any level, then those courses would be for you. And the other site that we've built is for those wanting to learn another language but just don't really know how to go about it. So it's full of courses with best practices in language learning and so on. Now, for both of those sites, we have put in a 14-day free trial period. So if you've been thinking about becoming a premium member to get access to those courses, this is the perfect time. Sign up, you get 14 days for free. And if any time in those 14 days you think, no, this is not really for me, no questions asked, you can cancel your subscription. You won't be charged a cent. So totally risk-free for you to try it out. All right. And don't forget also, if you're not quite ready to become a premium member to get access to the online course library, we do have a free community membership, which just means you're joining our Facebook group, and you can also receive our regular emails. So you can do that for free today as well. All right, that's all I've got time for today. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the inspiring CLESOL conference. Just a heads up, it super inspired me to learn te reo again, to get back on that bandwagon. So I attended my first te reo class yesterday, and that will be the topic of our next podcast, how that went. All right, ka kite anō. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can see more at www.languagefuel.com/podcast, or you can see us on YouTube at youtube.com/languagefuel.